On September 12, 490 BC, on the bloodied plains of Marathon, Greek soldiers stumbled upon a sight that would haunt military historians for millennia. Beneath the morning mist, they found not just Persian bodies fallen in honorable combat, but something far more disturbing: thousands of enemy soldiers crushed into the earth, their bodies bearing not the clean wounds of Greek bronze, but the devastating imprints of hooves. Ribs caved inward, skulls fractured like pottery, spines snapped at impossible angles. These men hadn't died fighting the Greeks. They had died fleeing from their own cavalry. The official Persian records would never speak of this. The Greek historians would barely whisper it. But what happened in those final moments of the Battle of Marathon wasn't just a military defeat. It was a catastrophic unraveling that turned an army's greatest strength into its most merciless executioner. But the truth was far more terrifying than anyone recorded. Before we uncover the truth about the Battle of Marathon horses, when 6,000 Persian soldiers were crushed by their own terrified war horses in a retreat that became a stampede, make sure to subscribe to Fear Sermon and ring that notification bell. We dig through the darkest corners of ancient history to bring you the stories that textbooks won't touch. Drop a comment telling us where your Ven begins. In the summer of 490 BC, Darius I makes a decision that will echo through the centuries. The Ionian Greeks, who revolted against Persian rule 5 years earlier with Athenian support, have been crushed. But Athens itself remains defiant, a festering insult to Persian authority. Darius orders an amphibious expedition, 600 ships carrying approximately 25,000 soldiers and at least 1,200 cavalry horses, all loaded aboard specialized transport vessels. The commander of this expedition is Datis, a Median general who has served Darius for 2 decades, and Artaphernes, the Persian king's nephew. Both men are veterans of multiple campaigns. Both have seen cavalry charges break enemy lines from Thrace to Ionia. Neither has ever witnessed cavalry fail. The fleet crosses the Aegean, island-hopping through the Cyclades, destroying Naxos and forcing Delos into submission. The message is clear: resist Persia, and you will be erased. Cooperate, and you may survive. By late August, the Persian fleet beaches on the northeastern coast of Attica, at a place the Greeks call Marathon. The choice of landing site is deliberate and tactically brilliant. The Marathon Plain is one of the few places in Attica with terrain suitable for cavalry operations, a relatively flat coastal plain roughly 8 miles long and 2 miles wide at its broadest point, bracketed by mountains to the west and the Aegean Sea to the east. For the Persian commanders, Marathon represents the perfect killing ground. The Athenian hoplites, if they dare to meet the Persians in open battle, will be forced to fight on terrain that favors cavalry. The Persian plan is elegant: pin the Greek phalanx with infantry, then unleash the cavalry on their flanks and rear. It's a tactic they've executed dozens of times. They see no reason it should fail now. The Athenian response: a city on the brink. When news reaches Athens that the Persians have landed at Marathon, the city erupts into barely controlled panic. This isn't theoretical anymore. This isn't distant wars fought in Ionia. The largest empire on earth has arrived on Athenian soil, 26 miles from the city walls, with enough soldiers to overwhelm Athens' entire citizen militia twice over. The Athenian assembly meets in emergency session. The debate is fierce, with some arguing for immediate surrender, others advocating for remaining behind Athens' walls and enduring a siege. But one voice cuts through the chaos: Miltiades, a general who has actually lived under Persian rule during his time in the Thracian Chersonese. Miltiades knows Persian tactics. More importantly, he knows Persian cavalry. They expect us to cower, Miltiades tells the assembly, his voice carrying across the Pnyx hill. They expect us to wait. They expect their cavalry to decide this war before it truly begins. But cavalry has a weakness: they need time to deploy, space to maneuver, and above all, they need their horses to obey. The assembly votes to march. All 9,000 Athenian hoplites who can be mustered, every citizen capable of bearing arms, are mobilized. Athens sends a runner named Phidippides to Sparta, covering 140 miles in 2 days, begging for military assistance. The Spartans, bound by religious law, claim they cannot march until the full moon passes. Athens will stand alone. Except they don't. Plataea, a small city-state that Athens once protected from Theban aggression, sends their entire military force, 1,000 hoplites. It's a gesture that will be remembered for 2,000 years. Together, the Greeks march toward Marathon with 10,000 heavy infantry in a desperate plan. The standoff, 5 days of psychological warfare, what follows is not the immediate clash of armies that later dramatists will portray. Instead, for 5 agonizing days, The two forces stare at each other across the Marathon plain, neither willing to commit to battle under unfavorable conditions. The Persians establish their camp on the northern portion of the plain, near their beached ships. The Greeks position themselves in the foothills at the southern end, blocking the two main routes that lead from Marathon to Athens. Both sides understand the stakes of positioning. For the Persians, the situation is clear. If they can draw the Greeks onto the open plain, their cavalry will decide the battle in minutes. Every morning, Persian cavalry squadrons parade in formation before the Greek lines, a not-so-subtle psychological tactic designed to advertise Persian strength and intimidate the opposition. The earth trembles with the synchronized beating of 1,200 sets of hooves. The Athenian farmers turned soldiers, many seeing war horses for the first time, feel their mouths go dry. But Miltiades refuses to take the bait. The Greeks maintain their position in the foothills, where the terrain, rocky, uneven, cut by seasonal streams, would bog down any cavalry charge. It's a standoff, but one that favors neither side indefinitely. The Persian commanders face a dilemma. They cannot remain at Marathon indefinitely. Their supplies, ferried across the Aegean, are finite. Moreover, intelligence reaches them that political factions within Athens might open the city gates to Persian forces if approached directly. The possibility exists of bypassing this armed standoff entirely. A plan begins to form. Datis orders a portion of the Persian force, primarily cavalry, to begin re-embarking on the ships. The official plan, as Persian officers explain it to their troops, is to sail around Cape Sonion and make directly for Athens, forcing the Greek army to choose between maintaining their position at Marathon or racing back to defend their city. It's a sound strategy, one that places the Athenians in an impossible position. But this decision, this seemingly tactical maneuver, is about to create the conditions for catastrophe. The horses, a gathering anxiety. Here's what the Persian military doctrine doesn't account for, what 2 decades of successful cavalry operations have hidden behind the glamour of victory. Horses are prey animals, and prey animals never fully overcome their instinct to flee. The Nisaean war horses of the Persian cavalry are magnificent creatures, yes. They've been trained extensively, yes. But they're also highly intelligent animals with nervous systems attuned over millions of years of evolution to detect danger. And for 5 days, these horses have been picketed in an increasingly tense environment. They smell the sea, an unfamiliar scent for horses bred in the inland plains of Media. They hear the constant clash of weapons being sharpened, armor being adjusted, men shouting in dozens of languages. They sense the anxiety of their riders, the tight grip on reins, the shortened tempers. They stand in unfamiliar terrain, fed unfamiliar fodder, surrounded by thousands of humans radiating stress. And then the re-embarkation begins. Horses being led onto ships, up narrow boarding ramps, into dark holes that rock with the waves. The animals that remain on shore watch their herd mates disappear, hear the whinnying from inside the vessels, feel the disruption of their established social groups. A cavalry horse trainer named Mithras, whose account survives only in fragments quoted by later Persian military manuals, writes this: "A horse separated from its herd exists in a state of constant alertness. Its eyes widen, its ears pivot constantly. It anticipates flight because it has lost the protection of numbers. When multiple horses exist in this state simultaneously, they do not calm each other, they amplify each other's fear." On the morning of September 12, 490 BC, roughly half the Persian cavalry, perhaps 600 horses and their riders, are aboard ships. The remaining 600 are picketed on the beach, scheduled for embarkation later that morning. The bulk of the Persian infantry, approximately 20,000 soldiers, remain encamped on the plain, assuming they'll either board ships later. March to Athens by land, depending on how the Greeks respond to the divided Persian force. None of them, not Datis, not Artaphernes, not the cavalry commanders, not the infantry officers, understand what's about to happen. Because at the southern end of the Marathon plain, Miltiades has received intelligence that changes everything. The Greek decision, September 12th, dawn a messenger arrives at the Greek camp with information from Ionian Greeks serving in the Persian forces, sympathizers who have been secretly sending intelligence to their ethnic kin. The message is simple but revolutionary. The Persian cavalry is boarding ships. Miltiades summons the other Greek generals. The debate that follows is brief but intense. Some argue that this is precisely the trap the Persians intend: lure the Greeks onto the plain now that cavalry is reduced, then unleash the remaining horsemen. Others contend that waiting ensures Athens faces an amphibious assault it cannot defend against. Miltiades argues for something that violates every conventional wisdom of Greek warfare: Attack immediately, before the full cavalry can deploy, and attack in a formation specifically designed to counter the Persian tactical advantage. The standard Greek phalanx is 8 men deep, a compromise between the force needed to break enemy lines and the width necessary to avoid flanking. Miltiades proposes something radical. Thin the center of the Greek phalanx to just 4 men deep, but strengthen the wings to 8 or even 10 men deep. The logic is counterintuitive but brilliant. Let the Persian center push back the weak Greek center, but use the strengthened wings to envelope the entire Persian army. It's a gambit, it's desperate, and it's the only chance the Greeks have. At dawn, the Athenian and Plataean hoplites form up. They number approximately 10,000 men stretched across a mile-long front. Each man wears a bronze helmet, carries a round shield, grips an 8-foot spear, and wears whatever armor his economic class can afford. They are not professional soldiers. They are citizen farmers, merchants, craftsmen. Many have never killed a man. Most have never seen a battle of this scale. Miltiades gives the order that will be quoted for centuries: at a run attack. This itself is revolutionary. Greek hoplites never run into battle. The phalanx is a walking formation, maintaining cohesion above all else. But Miltiades understands something crucial. Every second the Greeks spend crossing the open ground is a second Persian cavalry could deploy. Speed for once matters more than perfect formation. The distance between the Greek and Persian lines is roughly 1 mile. The Greeks begin to run. Not a sprint. No man can sprint a mile in bronze armor, but a steady ground-eating lope that carries them across the marathon, plain faster than the Persians believed possible. And on the Persian side, everything begins to unravel. Incident 1. The morning commotion. The first Persian sentries to spot the Greek advance cannot believe what they're seeing. Hoplites don't charge. Everyone knows this. Greek warfare is a slow, ritualized affair. 2 phalanxes meeting in the center of an agreed-upon field, pushing against each other until one side breaks. This running attack violates every precedent. The sentries sound the alarm, but there's immediate confusion. Most of the Persian infantry is not in formation. Soldiers are eating morning rations, adjusting equipment, or watching the ongoing cavalry embarkation on the beach. The Persian commanders, having posted guards specifically to warn of any Greek movement, had calculated they would have at least an hour to deploy once the Greeks descended from the foothills. They have perhaps 15 minutes. Officers begin shouting orders in multiple languages: Persian, Median, Aramaic, even some Greek for the Ionian conscripts. The Persian infantry begins scrambling into formation, but there's no time to establish the complex positioning that Persian tactics require. The archers, who typically operate behind screens of infantry, barely have time to string their bows. The infantry units, normally deployed in deep formations with specialized troops positioned for maximum effectiveness, form up in whatever position soldiers can reach. And the cavalry, the supposedly decisive cavalry, faces a more serious problem. The 600 horses still on the beach are picketed in groups, organized by squadron. Their riders are scattered. Some are aboard ships checking on horses already loaded. Some are at the command tent receiving embarkation orders. Some are simply elsewhere in the sprawling camp. The Greek charge has caught the Persian cavalry at the single worst moment imaginable, with half their force inaccessible aboard ships and the other half not mounted. A cavalry commander named Arshama, whose name survives in Greek accounts as Arsames, begins screaming orders to mount up. Grooms and cavalry troopers rush to the picket lines, grabbing saddles and bridles, but the horses, already nervous from days of tension and morning's disruption, react to the sudden urgency with heightened anxiety. Several horses rear as handlers try to bridle them. Others pull back against their tethers, eyes rolling white with agitation. The sound of thousands of Greek warriors chanting their battle cry, "Elilou! Elilou!" carries across the plain, and it's a sound these horses have never heard before. It's not the familiar pre-battle noise they've been conditioned to tolerate. It's a rising crescendo of organized violence, getting closer every second. Arshama manages to mount his own horse and wheel to assess the situation. What he sees turns his blood cold. Of the 600 horses, perhaps 200 are mounted with riders ready for combat. Another 200 are in various stages of being saddled. The remaining 200 are still tethered, with handlers struggling to control increasingly agitated animals. The Persian infantry is forming up 500 yards ahead, establishing a defensive line to receive the Greek charge. Standard cavalry tactics call for horsemen to be positioned on the flanks, ready to sweep around once the infantry lines engage. But there's no time. Arshama makes a decision that seems reasonable in the moment but will prove catastrophic. He orders the mounted cavalry to position themselves directly behind the infantry line, where they can deploy to flanks once the situation stabilizes. It's a decision that places 200 mounted war horses in a space roughly 300 yards deep, between the Persian infantry line and the beach where the remaining 400 horses are still being prepared. Everyone involved assumes this is temporary, that within minutes the cavalry will either deploy to flanks or the Greek attack will be repulsed by Persian archery and infantry, buying time for full cavalry mobilization. No one considers what might happen if the Persian infantry line collapses. Incident 2, the clash of shields. The Greek charge hits the Persian line like a hammer striking pottery. The shock of impact is audible. 10,000 bronze shields colliding with Persian wicker shields, 8-foot Greek spears punching into Persian infantry. Men in the front ranks on both sides die in the first 3 seconds of contact, bodies falling before their minds can fully process what's happening. But the battle doesn't develop as either side anticipates. The weakened Greek center, thinned to just 4 ranks deep, immediately begins to buckle under Persian pressure. This is exactly what Miltiades planned, but for the individual Greek soldiers in that center, it feels like failure. They're being pushed back, step by step, their thin line bending as Persian numbers tell. The Persian commanders see this and make a rational decision, press the advantage in the center, break through the Greek line, then collapse their flanks from the interior. It's sound tactics. Dozens of battles have been won this way. Officers shout encouragement. The P.E. Razion center surges forward with renewed aggression, but on both flanks something completely different is happening. The strengthened Greek wings, 8 to 10 men deep, composed of Athens's best warriors, are not just holding, they're winning. The depth of their formations gives them mass and momentum that the Persian flanks cannot match. The Greek right wing, led by the Plataeans, begins to curve inward. The Greek left wing, commanded by Miltiades himself, does the same. Within 10 minutes of initial contact, the battle has formed into a horseshoe shape. The Greek center bent backward in retreat, but both Greek wings advancing aggressively, beginning to envelope the Persian flanks. Persian officers in the center, focused on exploiting what they perceive as Greek weakness ahead of them, don't immediately recognize the danger. But the Persian soldiers on the flanks certainly do. They can see Greek hoplites appearing not just in front of them but beginning to appear beside them, then behind them. The realization spreads like poison. They're being surrounded. And behind the entire Persian infantry line, in that 300-yard gap between the fighting and the beach, 200 mounted Persian cavalry horses stand in increasingly tight formation. They can hear the battle but cannot see it clearly through the mass of infantry. What they experience is noise. Screaming men, the clash of metal, shouted orders in a dozen languages, and pressure. As the Persian infantry line bends, shifts, and begins to compress, the cavalry horses find themselves being pushed backward toward the beach by the sheer mass of bodies ahead of them. Arshama tries to maneuver his squadrons, to find space to deploy to the flanks where cavalry is supposed to operate. But there's no space. The Greek wings are collapsing inward, narrowing the entire battlefield. Moving to the left flank would mean riding directly into Greek spear points. Moving to the right would accomplish the same. The only open direction is backward, toward the beach. What had been an orderly, if hasty, positioning of cavalry behind the infantry line is now becoming something else, a compression. The horses stand shoulder to shoulder, riders struggling to maintain control as their mounts begin to sense that something is very wrong. And then, in the Persian center, the breakthrough happens, but not the way Persian commanders intended. Incident 3, the first break. The exact moment when the Persian center begins to collapse is impossible to pinpoint, but the Greek soldiers who survive will all describe the same phenomenon. One moment they're being pushed backward, shields locked, legs straining to hold ground against superior numbers, and the next moment the pressure releases. Not gradually, but suddenly, like a dam breaking. It starts with the Persian infantry on the immediate flanks of the center, the units that can see both the Greek breakthrough on the wings and the Persian success in the center. These soldiers, equipped with wicker shields and light armor, begin to recognize that they're in a pincer. The Greeks aren't just fighting anymore, they're wrapping around. The first Persians to break and run do so for completely rational reasons. They can see they're about to be encircled, and encircled soldiers in ancient warfare don't get captured for ransom. They die, stabbed in the back as they try to surrender or crushed under the enemy advance. Running seems like survival. But when the first 50 men turn and run, the 50 behind them lose the protection of the front rank. Suddenly exposed to Greek spears, they break too. And the 50 behind them. The collapse propagates backward through the Persian center like a wave. Each rank's retreat exposing the rank behind it. Within 2 minutes, what was an organized fighting retreat becomes a rout. Thousands of Persian infantry soldiers turn and flee back toward the beach, toward their ships, toward safety. They drop their weapons, wicker shields, spears, arrows, anything that slows them down. Their only thought is to reach the ships before the Greeks reach them. And they run directly into their own cavalry. The cavalry horses, already compressed and anxious, suddenly face a wall of panicked men running at them. The mounted Persian riders try to control their mounts, try to push back against the tide of infantry, try to establish any kind of order. It's impossible. The fleeing infantry splits around individual horses, flows between riders, creates a churning chaos of human and animal bodies. Arshama's horse rears, nearly throwing him. He regains control but realizes the situation is deteriorating by the second. His cavalry squadrons are no longer coherent units, their individual riders scattered among hundreds of panicked infantry, all being pushed backward toward the increasingly crowded beach. He makes a second decision, one that seems logical but will prove fatal: order a fighting withdrawal to the ships. Get the cavalry off the beach, maintain some unit cohesion, and redeploy once infantry is boarded. It's the textbook response to a collapsing line, but textbooks don't account for what happens when 200 mounted warhorses try to execute a controlled withdrawal through a mass of terrified men while being pursued by 10,000 Greek hoplites baying for blood. Incident 4, the exact moment when organized retreat becomes catastrophic stampede, will be debated by military historians for centuries. But survivors, both Persian and Greek, will identify the same trigger point: the horses on the beach. Remember the 400 horses still being saddled at the picket lines when the battle began. For the past 20 minutes, grooms and handlers have been working frantically to prepare these animals for mounting, even as the sounds of battle grew closer. Some are now saddled and bridled, held by handlers awaiting orders. Others are still half prepared, confused by the rushing activity. All of them are herd animals, and all of them can now see the other horses, their herd mates, being pushed backward into the beach area by a mass of fleeing humans. More critically, they can smell what the mounted horses have already recognized: fear, pheromones. Horses communicate anxiety through scent, and the mounted cavalry horses are radiating terror into the air. The picket lines hold, barely. But then the first of the fleeing Persian infantry reaches the beach proper. Thousands of men, no longer maintaining any military formation, stream around the picketed horses. Soldiers stumble into tether lines. Others run between horses, slapping flanks as they pass. One horse, struck by an accidentally swung sword still gripped by a fleeing soldier, screams in pain. That scream is the trigger. One picketed horse pulls back hard against its tether. The rope, strained beyond its strength, snaps. The horse, suddenly free, doesn't run toward the ships or toward safety. It runs away from the chaos, directly toward the approaching Greek lines. This is not courage. This is panic. The horse is a prey animal executing its most fundamental program: flee the predator. But to the other horses, this flight looks like herd movement. In the wild, when one horse flees, the herd follows. No debate, no hesitation, no individual assessment of danger. It's evolutionary wisdom condensed into instinct. If one member of the herd runs, there's probably a reason. 6 horses break their tethers and bolt in different directions. Then 20. Then all of them. Within 30 seconds, 400 war horses, thousands of pounds of muscle and bone per animal, are in full panic flight. Some run toward the water, plunging into the surf where they become trapped by the sea on one side and the chaos on shore on the other. Others run toward the ships, boarding ramps collapsing under their uncontrolled weight, wood splintering, horses falling into the gap between ship and shore. But the majority, perhaps 250 horses, run directly back through the beach area toward the plain, away from both the advancing Greeks and the compression of bodies at the shore. Directly into the mounted cavalry and fleeing infantry. Arshama sees the stampede coming and yanks his horse's head around, trying to get out of the path. Some riders manage the same, but there's nowhere to go. The beach area, 300 yards deep, is packed with thousands of fleeing men and 200 mounted horses, all trying to move in different directions. The stampeding horses don't slow down. They've fully entered flight mode, a state where conscious thought shuts down and movement becomes automatic. They're running from danger, and every instinct says, run faster, run harder, run through anything in the way. A war horse at full gallop weighs roughly 1,000 pounds and moves at 25 to 30 miles per hour. That's enough kinetic energy to snap human bones like dry twigs. and there are 250 of them running in a loosely coordinated panic through an area packed with human bodies. The first infantry soldier hit by the stampede doesn't even see the horse coming. He's looking backward, watching for Greek pursuit. The impact lifts him off his feet and throws him 15 feet. He's dead before he hits the ground, ribs caved in, internal organs ruptured. The second soldier sees the horses and tries to dodge. He's trampled by the next horse in line, hooves crushing his spine. The third, fourth, fifth, on, a domino chain of death. The mounted cavalry horses, already agitated, react to the stampede by entering their own panic. They can't distinguish between the riderless stampede horses and their own herd mates. All they know is that horses are fleeing, so they should flee too. Riders lose control. Horses that were barely controllable minutes ago become completely unmanageable. They rear, buck, wheel in tight circles. Some riders are thrown, and once on the ground they become just more obstacles for panicked horses to trample. Arshama feels his mount surge beneath him, every muscle tensing for flight. He hauls on the reins with both hands, his arms straining, and for a moment maintains control. Then a riderless horse slams into his mount's shoulder at full speed. Both horses go down in a tangle of legs and bodies. Arshama is thrown clear, landing hard on rocky ground. He looks up in time to see a wall of horses bearing down on him. This is the moment when tactical retreat becomes massacre. The Persian cavalry, the pride of Darius's military, is no longer a fighting force. It's a chaotic mass of terrified animals trampling everything, friend, foe, their own riders, in a mindless attempt to escape perceived danger. The Greeks pursuing the fleeing Persians begin to notice the change before they understand what's happening. The mass of enemy soldiers ahead of them seems to be churning, collapsing inward. The sounds of battle, clashing metal, shouted orders are being replaced by something else. Screaming. Not battle cries, but screams of pure terror and agony. A Plataean hoplite named Aeschylus, brother to the famous playwright, will later describe what he saw as the Greeks reached the beach area. We expected to find men fighting to board ships, expected final resistance from their elite cavalry. Instead, we found hell's own chaos. Horses without riders running in all directions, their hooves red. Men crushed into the earth so thoroughly that from 10 paces distant they appeared as merely dark stains on the sand. And everywhere, the sounds of men dying not from Greek bronze but from the hooves of their own war mounts. The Greek advance slows, then stops. Individual hoplites stand transfixed by what they're witnessing. A war horse, eyes rolling white with terror, gallops past them without acknowledging their existence, heading inland toward the mountains. Another is running in tight circles, trampling the same ground repeatedly, unable to break the pattern its panic has established. The Persian infantry, still capable of running, has reached the ships and is boarding in a chaotic scramble. But between the Greek lines and the shore lies a 300-yard killing zone where horses, both stampeding and fallen, have created a landscape of death. Bodies lie everywhere, but they're unlike the casualties of normal battle. These men don't have spear wounds or sword cuts. They've been crushed with such force that their bodies barely maintain human shape. One soldier's torso is flattened to perhaps 6 inches thick, ribs splintered and pushed out through the skin. Another's head has been completely destroyed, transformed into an unrecognizable pulp mixed with sand and blood. A young Athenian warrior, a potter's son named Callias, vomits at the sight. He's just fought his first battle, killed his first men in face-to-face combat, but that seems clean compared to this. The men we killed died with honor, he'll later tell the assembly. But these, they died like animals in a stockyard, crushed by the very creatures meant to give them victory. The Greek commanders, Miltiades and the other generals, push through to assess the situation. What they find shocks even these veteran warriors. Miltiades has fought Persians before, has witnessed the aftermath of cavalry charges. He's never seen anything like this. Scattered among the crushed bodies are Persian cavalry troopers still mounted, still struggling to control maddened horses. These riders present a surreal sight. Enemy soldiers technically still on the battlefield but so occupied with controlling their mounts that they're incapable of fighting. Some Greeks move to attack them. Miltiades shouts an order to hold. "Let them go," he commands. "We've won the battle. These men are already defeated." It's a decision that will spark controversy later, but in the moment, it's recognition of an obvious truth. The Persian cavalry is no longer a military force. It's a tragedy in progress. As the Greeks begin moving through the killing zone toward the ships, where final skirmishes are still occurring as Persians fight to protect their evacuation, They start finding the details that will haunt their victory for years. A cavalry officer, later identified by his elaborate armor as a squadron commander, lies with his chest completely caved in. Near him is his horse, also dead, its skull fractured. Apparently, both rider and mount were trampled by the stampede. Investigators piece together that this officer, likely Arshama himself, though his body is too damaged for certain identification, was thrown from his horse and then crushed along with the animal when they both fell into the path of the stampede. Another cavalry trooper is found wedged between two fallen horses, himself miraculously unharmed but unable to move, watching helplessly as battle raged around him. Greek soldiers extract him, and he's so traumatized that he cannot speak, merely pointing back toward the killing zone and shaking his head repeatedly. The most disturbing finds are the clusters, places where the stampede created bottlenecks and multiple horses trampled the same ground repeatedly. In one spot, 13 Persian infantry soldiers lie so thoroughly crushed and mixed together that separating individual bodies becomes impossible. Their bones are broken into fragments, their armor is pressed flat, their blood has mixed with sand to create a muddy paste. A Greek surgeon brought forward to treat wounded Greek soldiers refuses to enter these areas. The dead are beyond any physician's art, he states, and no living man should witness this closely what war's chaos can create. But the task of assessment must continue. Athenian officers, working under Miltiades' orders, begin the grim work of counting bodies. It's not easy. Many corpses are unrecognizable. Some bodies are in pieces, scattered by the impacts. Others are so crushed that they barely register as human from a distance. The preliminary count is staggering. In the main killing zone, that 300-yard strip Beto, in the Persian infantry line and the beach, they find approximately 4,200 bodies showing signs of trampling death. Another 1,800 in the immediate beach area bear similar wounds. The total number of Persians killed by their own cavalry exceeds 6,000 soldiers. By contrast, the entire Greek force suffers 192 casualties in the actual battle, almost all on the initial clash of infantry lines. The Persians killed by Greek weapons number perhaps 600 men. The mathematics is brutal and clear. The Persian cavalry killed 10 times as many of their own soldiers as the Greek army managed in the entire battle. As the afternoon wears on and Persian ships begin pulling away from shore, those that successfully loaded survivors, the Greeks find themselves in possession of a battlefield unlike any in recorded history. The Marathon plain is soaked with blood, but most of it is Persian, and most of those Persians died running from their own horses. Among the wreckage, Greeks find abandoned cavalry equipment, bridles snapped by panicked horses, saddles torn from for thrashing animals, and everywhere hoofprints pressed into blood-soaked ground, marking the paths of death. One Athenian, a man named Cynaegirus, Aeschylus's other brother, is killed in the fighting at the ships, grabbing a Persian vessel and having his hand cut off by an axe. He becomes celebrated as a hero who died honorably in combat. But privately, Greek soldiers acknowledge that Cynaegirus' death, while tragic, fits the expected pattern of warfare. The 6,000 Persians crushed by their own cavalry died in a way that warfare isn't supposed to work. They died because a machine, the Persian cavalry system, catastrophically failed under pressure it was supposedly designed to withstand. As evening falls on Marathon, the Greeks begin the traditional post-battle rituals, collecting their dead for cremation, stripping valuable armor from enemy corpses, offering prayers to the gods. But there's a numbness to the proceedings, a shocked silence that persists even among the victors. Miltiades stands at the edge of the killing zone, looking out over the wreckage. An aide approaches and asks if they should pursue the Persian fleet. Miltiades shakes his head. They're broken, he says. Not just defeated, but broken in spirit. Let them carry this memory back to Darius. Let them tell him what happened when his perfect cavalry met real pressure. What neither Miltiades nor any Greek present fully understands is that they haven't just won a battle, they've exposed a critical flaw in Persian military doctrine. Cavalry, for all its power, is only as reliable as the animal's training holds under maximum stress. And the Nicaean horses, for all their breeding and conditioning, remained prey animals at their core. When their survival instincts overrode their training, they became the most effective killers on the battlefield. Just not for the side that brought them. The immediate response, securing victory, the first priority for the Athenian commanders, is ensuring the Persian fleet doesn't simply sail around Cape Sunion and attack Athens while the city is undefended. Miltiades orders his army to march immediately back to Athens, 26 miles in full armor, many soldiers already exhausted from the morning's battle. The march itself becomes legendary. The same men who ran a mile at dawn to engage the Persians now force march 26 miles in the afternoon heat, arriving back at Athens just as the Persian fleet appears off the coast. Seeing the Athenian army deployed and ready, the Persians abandon any thought of attacking and sail back to Asia Minor. Athens is saved. But the victory comes with disturbing questions that the city's leaders must address. Within days of the battle, the Athenian assembly convenes a formal investigation. The official purpose is to distribute honors and rewards to the battle's heroes, but the underlying agenda is to understand and document what actually happened at Marathon. The assembly needs to know, was this victory the result of Greek military genius, divine intervention, Persian incompetence, or something else entirely? Miltiades presents his tactical analysis to the assembly, explaining the strategy of weakening the center and strengthening the wings. The assembly honors this military innovation, voting Miltiades special recognition. But when discussion turns to the Persian cavalry's collapse, Miltiades' explanation becomes more uncertain. We disrupted their deployment, he states. We forced them into chaos before they could execute their battle plan. But what happened on that beach, that transcends military tactics. That was animals reverting to their nature under pressure no training could prepare them for. The assembly authorizes a formal documentation project. Scribes interview Greek survivors, record their observations, and attempt to piece together a coherent narrative of how 6,000 enemy soldiers died from trampling. But the resulting reports are fragmentary and often contradictory. Soldiers who witnessed different parts of the killing zone provide accounts that seem to describe entirely different events. One consistent element emerges from all accounts: the horses didn't attack. They fled. This isn't cavalry executing a charge gone wrong or war animals turned against their handlers by enemy action. This is a stampede, a panic flight that coincidentally occurred in the middle of a battle. The distinction becomes important for how Greeks understand their victory. If the Persian horses had been somehow turned against their riders through Greek action, divine intervention perhaps, or some clever tactic, that would be one thing. But the truth is more unsettling. The Persians defeated themselves through a systemic failure in their cavalry doctrine. The Persian response, silence and revision on the Persian side. The response to Marathon is immediate suppression of the truth. Datis and Artaphernes, the expedition commanders, arrive back in Persia with approximately 19,000 of the 25,000 soldiers they departed with. They report a battlefield loss to Darius I, acknowledging defeat but providing carefully sanitized accounts. The official Persian version of Marathon, as recorded in royal chronicles, states simply, "The Athenians met us in battle. They prevailed through trickery and advantageous terrain. Our forces withdrew in good order to preserve the army for future campaigns." No mention of stampeding horses, no acknowledgement that Persian cavalry killed more Persians than the Greek army did. No discussion of 6,000 soldiers crushed by their own war mounts. This silence is strategic. The Persian Empire is built on an image of overwhelming military superiority. Acknowledging that their elite cavalry, the tactical innovation that helped conquer 23 nations, catastrophically failed under pressure, would undermine that image across the entire empire. But suppressing official acknowledgement doesn't erase the truth. Persian soldiers who survived Marathon talk among themselves. The story spreads through the military ranks. Within months, cavalry units across the Persian Empire have heard whispered accounts of what happened on that beach. The effect on cavalry morale is profound and long-lasting. Persian cavalry troopers begin questioning whether their horses are as reliable as doctrine claims. They start noticing things that military training had conditioned them to ignore: the way horses startle at unexpected sounds, the visible nervousness in their mounts before battle, the constant management required to keep war horses under control. A cavalry officer named Histiaeus, who serves in subsequent Persian campaigns, writes in a private letter discovered centuries later, "Since Marathon, we ride with new fear, not fear of the enemy, but fear of our own mounts. Every battle I watch my horse's ears searching for signs of panic. Every unexpected noise I tighten my reins. Marathon taught us that the create. Euras we thought mastered can never be fully trusted." Legal and military reforms, lessons unlearned following Marathon. The Persian military establishment faces a choice: acknowledge the cavalry's vulnerability and reform their tactics, or double down on cavalry doctrine while implementing superficial changes to prevent another Marathon. They choose the latter. Rather than questioning whether cavalry can be relied upon as a decisive force, Persian military planners attribute the Marathon disaster to specific circumstances: insufficient time to deploy, unfavorable terrain, divided command with half the cavalry aboard ships. The solution, they decide, is not to reduce reliance on cavalry, but to ensure cavalry always deploys under ideal conditions. New regulations are issued throughout the Persian military, Cavalry must always deploy on flat, open terrain. Cavalry should never be positioned in close proximity to infantry during initial battle formation. Cavalry embarkation and disembarkation must follow strict protocols to avoid leaving horses in incomplete deployment. These reforms address symptoms rather than causes. They assume the problem was tactical execution, not a fundamental limitation in using prey animals as weapons of war. The Greek military establishment, meanwhile, draws entirely different lessons. Athens emerges from Marathon as the dominant power in Greece, and their tactical innovations become studied by other city-states. The idea of adapting phalanx formation to specific battlefield conditions rather than relying on a single standard formation revolutionizes Greek military thinking. But even the Greeks miss the deeper lesson. They focus on their tactical brilliance, the weakened center, the strong wings, the running charge, without fully appreciating that they won largely because their enemy's supposedly unstoppable cavalry turned into their enemy's executioner. The survivors, trauma and memory for the soldiers who witnessed the Stampede, both Greek and Persian, Marathon becomes a source of lasting psychological trauma. Modern understanding of post-traumatic stress disorder provides vocabulary that ancient sources lack, but the symptoms described in surviving accounts are unmistakable. Aeschylus, the playwright who fought at Marathon, never directly writes about the battle, but his later plays, particularly The Persians, are filled with imagery of chaos, defeat, and the gods' capacity to turn human plans into catastrophe. Scholars who analyze his work note recurring themes of hubris leading to downfall, of sophisticated plans unraveling, of technology and training failing under divine pressure. One surviving fragment of a lost Aeschylus play contains these lines: "The beasts we thought broken revealed their true nature, not when whipped forward, but when pushed beyond bearing." Persian survivors face different challenges. Many are dispersed to other units, their marathon service becoming an unofficial mark against their records. The Persian military doesn't formally punish survivors. That would require acknowledging what happened. But career advancement becomes difficult for anyone associated with the Marathon expedition. A handful of Persian accounts survive, most discovered in personal letters or private documents never meant for public circulation. These reveal men haunted by what they witnessed. One cavalry officer writes, "I see them still when I close my eyes. My brothers crushed beneath hooves calling for help I could not provide. I survived by controlling my mount when others could not. Is that valor or merely fortune? I do not know." The dead, burial, and memorith aftermath of Marathon requires disposal of thousands of bodies, a logistical challenge complicated by the nature of death. Greek custom requires cremation of citizen soldiers, their ashes returned to Athens for ceremonial burial. The 192 Athenian and Plataean dead receive this honor, cremated on funeral pyres with full military ceremony. But what to do with 6,000 Persian corpses, many crushed beyond recognition, in a coastal plain during summer heat? The Athenians implement a pragmatic solution: mass burial. They excavate large trenches in the Marathon plain and inter the Persian dead collectively, with minimal ceremony. It's not disrespectful per se. Greek custom doesn't extend to enemy soldiers, but it's impersonal and efficient. Centuries later, archaeologists excavating the Marathon plain will discover these mass graves. The skeletal remains show distinctive patterns, multiple fractures consistent with impact trauma, bones shattered rather than cut, evidence of crushing force applied across large areas of the body. Forensic analysis confirms what ancient accounts described. These men were trampled to death. One grave, excavated in the 1960s CE, contains the remains of 13 individuals so thoroughly intermingled that individual skeletons cannot be separated. All show evidence of massive blunt force trauma. The excavation report notes, the archaeological evidence supports ancient accounts of a stampede. The positions and fracture patterns are consistent with multiple large animals traversing the same space repeatedly, creating a churning effect that mixed human remains. The Athenians erect a victory monument at Marathon, a simple stone marker commemorating their fallen. The inscription makes no mention of Persian cavalry or stampeding horses. It states simply, "The Athenians and Plataeans defeated the Persians at Marathon. 192 Greeks died. The barbarians suffered many times more. The Persian dead received no monument. Their mass graves remain unmarked, their names unrecorded, their deaths officially unacknowledged by the empire they served." Political ramifications: a shifting balance. Marathon's aftermath reshapes the political landscape of the ancient world. Athens, previously a second-tier Greek city-state, emerges as a major power. The victory proves that Persian forces are not invincible, that the empire's military machine can be defeated by determined, well-led opposition. This emboldens Greek resistance. When Darius I dies in 486 BC and his son Xerxes plans an even larger invasion of Greece a decade after Marathon, the Greek city-states remember Marathon. They recall that Persian cavalry, supposedly unstoppable, stampeded its own army to death. They draw confidence from this memory, however selectively they remember the details. The Second Persian invasion of 480-479 BC is partially shaped by Marathon's legacy. Xerxes brings an overwhelmingly larger force. Estimates range from 100,000 to 300,000 soldiers, specifically to avoid another embarrassing defeat. And critically, Persian cavalry tactics are modified. Horses are never again positioned in close proximity to infantry during initial deployments. Cavalry operations become more conservative, more cautious, less reliant on the decisive charge that Marathon was supposed to demonstrate. But Marathon's political impact extends beyond military tactics. It becomes a founding myth for Athenian democracy. The citizen soldiers who stood at Marathon, farmers, craftsmen, merchants, defeated a professional imperial army. This validates the democratic principle that citizens fighting for their freedom can overcome despotic tyranny. Historians will debate for centuries whether this interpretation is fair. After all, the Athenians won largely because Persian cavalry malfunctioned catastrophically, not solely through Greek military genius. But myths serve political purposes regardless of complexity, and the myth of Marathon becomes essential to Athenian identity. The cover-up, what official histories omit, perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Marathon's aftermath, is what doesn't get recorded. The official histories, both Greek and Persian, minimize or omit entirely the cavalry stampede that killed 6,000 Persians. Herodotus, writing 50 years after Marathon, provides the most detailed surviving account of the battle. He mentio that the Persians fled to their ships and that many died in this flight. He notes that the Greeks pursued them to the shore. But he provides virtually no details about how those Persians died, saying only that many barbarians fell. This omission is puzzling until you consider the political context. Herodotus is writing to celebrate Greek military prowess, acknowledging that most Persian casualties resulted from their own cavalry's panic flight rather than Greek weapons diminishes the glory of Greek arms. Better to suggest the Persians were cut down in heroic pursuit than crushed by panicked horses. The Persian side is even more silent. No official Persian chronicle mentions Marathon in any detail. The royal archives at Persepolis, discovered by archaeologists in the 20th century CE, contain numerous administrative documents from Darius I's reign, but nothing substantive about the Marathon expedition beyond basic record-keeping. Ships allocated, supplies distributed, soldiers mobilized. This mutual silence, Greeks understating how Persians actually died, Persians refusing to acknowledge the defeat at all, creates a historical record that obscures the battle's most significant lesson, that military technology, however sophisticated, remains vulnerable to catastrophic failure when biological systems like horses are pushed beyond their evolved capacity. Modern military historians, examining Marathon with the benefit of hindsight and comparative analysis of other battles involving cavalry, recognize what ancient sources obscure. Marathon demonstrates the inherent limitations of using animals as weapon systems. Horses, no matter how well trained, remain prey animals capable of panic flight. When that panic triggers in the wrong tactical moment, the results can be more devastating than any enemy action. But in 490 BC, with the bodies still being buried and the political narratives still being crafted, this lesson goes largely unlearned. Both sides prefer to attribute Marathon's outcome to more controllable factors: Greek tactical genius or Persian bad luck with timing and terrain. The cavalry stampede that killed 6,000 soldiers becomes a footnote, an embarrassment, a detail to be minimized in official accounts and whispered about in private. Until now. Redefining ancient warfare, Marathon's cavalry catastrophe forces a fundamental reassessment of how we understand ancient military technology. For centuries, military historians operated under the assumption that cavalry represented an unambiguous technological advancement, a weapon system that, if properly deployed, provided decisive battlefield superiority. Marathon reveals this assumption to be dangerously incomplete. Cavalry is not merely a technology, it's a biological system, and biological systems carry inherent vulnerabilities that no amount of training can fully eliminate. In the decades following Marathon, both Greek and Persian military establishments grapple with this realization in different ways. The Greeks, who traditionally relied on heavy infantry and viewed cavalry with suspicion, see their skepticism validated. They developed military doctrine that treats cavalry as auxiliary forces, useful for scouting and pursuit but never decisive in pitched battle. The Persians, whose empire depends on cavalry superiority, cannot afford such skepticism. Instead, they implement what modern military theorists would call risk mitigation, accepting that cavalry remains essential while developing protocols to minimize the chance of another marathon. Stricter training regimens, more elaborate deployment procedures, redundant command structures. But these reforms treat symptoms rather than addressing root causes. The fundamental vulnerability remains: horses are prey animals, and prey animals will always prioritize survival flight over human commands when sufficiently stressed. This lesson echoes through military history. Centuries later, during the medieval period, European knights mounted on destriers, war horses bred for size and aggression, discover similar limitations. A well-trained destrier can carry a knight in armor and execute controlled charges, but introduce pikes, or fire, or sufficient chaos, and those same destriers panic, throwing riders or fleeing through friendly formations. The principle persists into the gunpowder age. Cavalry remains a battlefield presence through the 19th century, but commanders learn to avoid positioning mounted troops where sudden panic could cause friendly casualties. The British cavalry disaster at Balaclava during the Crimean War 1854 CE, when 600 cavalry charged into entrenched artillery and were decimated, echoes Marathon's lessons about what happens when cavalry is committed without adequate reconnaissance and control. Only with the mechanization of warfare in the 20th century CE does this vulnerability finally get eliminated, not through better training but by replacing biological systems with mechanical ones. A tank cannot panic, a truck cannot stampede. The horse's long career as a military technology ends not because better horses were bred, but because machines replaced them entirely. The Psychology of Military Failure Marathon offers a case study in how military systems fail under pressure. The Persian cavalry didn't fail because of inadequate training or poor equipment. Individual horses were well trained. Individual riders were skilled. The cavalry doctrine was sophisticated and had proven effective in dozens of previous engagements. The system failed because it was built on an unstated assumption that horses could be conditioned to remain controllable in any battlefield scenario. When Marathon created conditions, partial deployment, immediate pressure, compressed space, acoustic chaos, that exceeded those assumptions, the entire system collapsed. This pattern recurs throughout military history. Complex weapon systems, designed and tested under controlled conditions, fail catastrophically when deployed in combat environments that exceed their design parameters. The assumption that this will work because it always has proves inadequate when the scenario differs in subtle but critical ways from past experiences. Modern military organizations study Marathon precisely because it illustrates this failure mode so clearly. The battle becomes a teaching case. How do you identify unstated assumptions in your doctrine? How do you test systems against worst-case scenarios rather than expected conditions? How do you build redundancy into systems that depend on biological components? The U.S. Army's Command and General Staff College, in a 2008 analysis titled "When Systems Fail: Historical Case Studies in Military Technology," devotes an entire chapter to Marathon. The analysis concludes, the Persian cavalry system was not defeated by superior enemy action. It was revealed as inadequate by conditions that should have been anticipated but weren't. The lesson for modern commanders: your most sophisticated systems are only as reliable as their worst-case performance, not their typical performance. The human cost of military innovation beyond tactical and strategic lessons. Marathon illustrates the human cost of treating living beings as military technology. The 6,000 Persians who died under their own cavalry's hooves were soldiers following orders, trusting in a system that their commanders assured them was reliable. When that system failed, they didn't die heroically in combat or even as a result of enemy action. They died because the military machine they served prioritized theoretical capability over practical limitations. They died because their commanders assumed horses could be made into reliable weapons and committed those forces without adequate contingency planning for what happens when living creatures panic. This raises ethical questions that extend far beyond ancient warfare. When military organizations employ biological systems, whether horses in 490 BC or military working dogs in modern conflicts, what responsibility do they bear for understanding and respecting the limitations of those systems? What happens when the drive for tactical advantage overrides consideration for the well-being of both human soldiers and animal participants? The Persians at Marathon become a cautionary tale about the gap between theory and practice, between laboratory conditions and battlefield chaos, between what military planners want their systems to do and what those systems actually can do under maximum stress. Marathon and cultural memory, perhaps most significantly, Marathon demonstrates how history remembers military disasters. The battle that should be remembered as the Cavalry catastrophe becomes known instead as the victory of democracy over tyranny. The specific mechanism of Persian defeat, trampled by their own horses, fades from popular narrative in favor of more palatable explanations. This selective memory serves political purposes. For Athens, Marathon becomes proof that free citizens defending their homeland can defeat professional imperial armies. For Persia, Marathon becomes an aberration, a defeat to be minimized and quickly avenged, unsuccessfully as it turns out, rather than a systemic failure requiring doctrinal overhaul. But the real lessons of Marathon, about biological limitations, about system failures, about the gap between doctrine and reality, largely go unlearned by contemporary military establishments. Both Greeks and Persians prefer to attribute outcomes to controllable factors, tactics, leadership, divine favor, rather than acknowledge the role of inherent system limitations. This pattern of selective memory persists. Modern militaries study historical battles, but they often extract comfortable lessons rather than uncomfortable ones. Marathon should teach that sophisticated weapon systems can fail catastrophically in ways that training and doctrine cannot prevent. Instead, it's typically taught as a story about tactical innovation and battlefield geometry. The 6,000 Persians crushed under cavalry hooves deserve to be remembered not just as casualties, but as warnings. They died because military planners made assumptions about horses that exceeded what biology would support. Their deaths should prompt humility about the limits of military technology, acknowledgement that living systems cannot be perfectly controlled, recognition that worst-case scenarios deserve more consideration than it's never happened before. But history prefers heroic narratives over cautionary ones. Marathon becomes a story of Greek triumph rather than Persian system failure, of brilliant tactics rather than biological limitations exposed, of Athens ascending rather than cavalry doctrine unraveling, until we look closely at the killing zone, at the forensic evidence, at the fragments of accounts that survived official censorship. Then the truth emerges. On September 12, 490 BC, on a coastal plain called Marathon, the most sophisticated cavalry force in the ancient world became a stampeding mass of panicked animals that killed its own army. And that uncomfortable truth has lessons that extend far beyond ancient Greece. So what do you think drove the Persian commanders to position their cavalry in a way that made this catastrophe possible? Was it overconfidence born from too many victories? Simple bad luck with timing? Or did the Persian military establishment's commitment to cavalry doctrine blind them to obvious risks? Leave your theories in the comments below. And if you found this deep dive into ancient military disasters fascinating, you'll want to subscribe to Fear Sermon. We're constantly uncovering these lost chapters of history, the stories that official records tried to bury, the disasters that shaped civilizations in ways that heroic narratives obscure. Next week, we're investigating another case where military technology exceeded safe operating parameters with catastrophic consequences. But this time it happens on a Roman siege tower, and the results are even more horrifying. Until then, remember, history's darkest lessons aren't found in the victories celebrated, but in the failures censored. See you in the next video.